So I just want to give a welcome to all the folks that are with us so far. It's about 4 minutes till, so we'll be getting started in just a few minutes. If you have a question, if you could just type that in the Q&A, we'll try and address those for you. So you can open up the Q&A box at the, most folks, the box will be at the bottom of their screen, and we'll be happy to try and address your questions. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. Thank you. Lori, thanks for your question about the double audio. Can you ask again and make sure that that's working well for you now?
Nicole, it was because I went live and it then had both backgrounds. So I've stopped sharing my audio now. So lesson learned, the person going live does not need to do the audio.
Thank you, Andrea. We'll be ready to get started in just 3 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Sanchez, she, her pronouns. I'm the assistant professor of horticulture here in Klamath Falls, Oregon. And I want to welcome you and thank you for coming today to this Oregon Gardeners Level Up session. This series is produced by the Oregon State University Extension Master Gardener Program, and it's been organized by a group of Master Gardener coordinators, many of whom are here today, as well as faculty and staff from across the state. The OSU Extension Master Gardener Program educates Oregonians about the art and science of growing and caring for plants. We are in 27 counties across the state and train thousands of Master Gardener volunteers. OSU Extension Master Gardeners are volunteer educators. So they're neighbors and on-the-ground researchers who serve the community with solid training in science-based sustainable gardening and have a love of lifelong learning. If you're a Master Gardener volunteer, thank you for dedicating your time and knowledge. If you're not a Master Gardener, but you're interested in becoming one, we'll be hosting training for new volunteers again in 2022. You can learn more about the program and other workshops on this series on our website. And today's series or workshop is being recorded, and it will be accessible to view along with a copy of the presentations and the other presentations in this series. So there'll be a link to that in the chat. Today's session has also been approved for accreditation by the Oregon Landscape Board. So if you would like to get credit for your certification with the Oregon Landscape Board, you can do that by sending an email to Heather Stoven. We'll have her email in the chat for you to see, and it will also be included in your follow-up email so that you'll be able to see that. Today's speaker is Amy Jo Detweiler. Amy Jo is in Bend, Oregon. She's a professor and extension horticulturalist responsible for teaching and outreach in community and commercial horticulture in the high desert environment of Central Oregon, working with homeowners and green industry professionals. Amy specializes in sustainable landscape practices, including water-wise gardening, fire-wise landscaping, backyard food production. She's also responsible for training and managing an active group of Master Gardener volunteers in 3 counties. So Amy is coming to us from Central Oregon today. And I wanted to share a little bit just about the history of the peoples in Central Oregon. So you're looking at a map of the part of the Pacific Northwest here that has different colors for the different tribes and native folks that were in Oregon, and specifically in Central Oregon previous to European settlement. And hopefully you can see from this overlay of different colors that there are actually quite a few native peoples who called Central Oregon home. In fact, there were as many as 8 tribes that used this land over time, some of which stayed sedentary in the area, and others which were more nomadic and followed the seasons and available resources and traveled throughout a wider range. The 3 tribes that are part of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs now are the Wasco, Warm Springs, and Northern Paiute tribes. And they have a pretty vigorous community in the Warm Springs area that you can see kind of at the top of the tip of the brown there. So we wanted to acknowledge that the use of this land and the folks that were here before us before we get started. So again, I want to welcome you all for being here. And Amy Jo, we're ready for you to share your screen now. And we're looking forward to learning more from you about Firewise landscaping.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm glad to be here with you today talking about Firewise landscaping. Here's a bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to just touch on the topics given the time frame that we have. And so we'll just touch on fire behavior, managing fuel, resources that are available to you, and then we'll more specifically speak to fire-wise landscaping and what that can look like in your own landscape. I like to let people know that, as Nicole mentioned, I'm a horticulturist. I'm not a fire scientist. Creating a defensible space encompasses a lot of different aspects to it. And today we really are just focusing on the fire-wise landscape component of creating a defensible space. So when I first started out in this job over 20 years ago, I started to collect newspaper articles about the different wildfires going on throughout the region and the state. And it seemed like I was collecting, some years we'd have more wildfires than others. And I felt like, okay, this is something I should kind of be keeping my eye on. What I didn't really realize was, as time was going on, I noticed that each year I was seeing more and more articles about wildfires in the region and in the country. And it seemed like we are on an upward trend. What really surprised me as we went was learning about fires not happening necessarily in wildfire hazard zones or the wildland urban interface, but also seeing wildfires pop up in urban environments. For example, the one that happened in Los Angeles, and we've seen several more examples of this ever since. So I got to a point where I actually stopped collecting articles because it seemed like there was just so many of them, wildfires happening throughout the country. So if you have an interest in learning more about the statistics as far as the number of acreages burned, how wildfires are started, if there are prescribed burns going on, all of that type of information, this is the website that you'll want to go to. I'm not going to open this up today given our time, but if you go to the National Interagency Fire Center, you can see the different types of information you can look up online. And so you can look these wildfire stats up by state and year. And so it might be interesting for you to go and see what's going on in your own state. And there's just a lot of other interesting information like the suppression costs related to wildfire management and that sort of thing. They've got this broken down really well if you have an interest in further investigating some of the stats. So here's an example of one from Oregon, the Oak Knoll fire that was back in 2010, that was in an urban environment. Although the acreage wasn't large on this, this wildfire came in and it started, you can see where the point of origin is on this slide. It started with a small blaze, but then the wind quickly picked it up. And next thing you know, you had spot fires across the highway. And this fire, it burned about 16 acres. But it did actually burn down 11 homes. You can see a close up there of, unfortunately, the homes that got burned down. And the primary fuel source in this fire was Leland cypress. And so that type of plant, as we'll learn a little bit later in the presentation, is known to be more fire prone. And that presentation of plants around these surrounding homes is what contributed greatly to these homes, unfortunately, burning. So I just want to start a little bit by talking about what's called the fire triangle. And it's just the 3 elements you need in order to have a fire exist or occur. You've got heat, oxygen, and fuel. You take any one of these elements away and the fire will go out. Additionally, we have what's called the fire behavior basic triangle, or what impacts or affects fire, and you have weather, topography, and fuel. So if you were to change any one of these elements, it's going to change both the intensity and the rate of spread. For example, if the wind picks up, then all of a sudden you're going to have a more intense, and the spread of wildfire is going to be more quick than it would be without the wind. If you were to put these two side by side, so you've got the fire triangle, the 3 elements it takes to have a fire, and then the fire behavior triangle side by side, you're going to see that the common denominator between these two is going to be fuel. And fortunately, that's the one element that we can influence on both of these triangles. So when I'm referring to fuel tip for today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about trees, shrubs, grass, structures, anything around the home that can burn. And we know that fires can ignite a home 3 different ways. They can ignite a home through direct contact, and this is when a flame is in direct contact with the home will start the fire. Here's an example of that in the skeleton fire that occurred in Bend back in 1996. We've got radiant heat, and this was part of an experiment that Jack Cohen did. Jack Cohen is one of the most well-known fire scientists. He's since retired, but he did an experiment where he was able to determine that radiant heat, meaning heat coming off of a wildfire, can start to ignite the siding of a home or the roofing of a home from 100 feet away or closer. And the third way that homes will burn down is through embers. And we heard a lot about that in the Paradise fires back in California. Embers are interesting in that it doesn't take very much for them to come up and through the ventilation system, even of a home, or to land on top of a flammable material roof in order to ignite the home. And you can see here a lot of embers around this home. So ways to help reduce that fuel load, because again, that's the one factor we can influence to try and change the behavior of a wildfire and the intensity and spread, is to create a defensible space around the home. We can do that by using the top 2 elements they'll tell you to try and influence or change would be making sure you're using fire safe building materials, the roofing material and siding. You can go with windows. And then also to try and create a defensible space using fire resistant plants. So we'll talk a little bit more, focus on what's called the home ignition zone. And the home ignition zone is in this diagram here. It's broken up into 3 different zones. You can see where the red line is. That's the immediate first 0 to 5 feet surrounding a home. And the recommendation for this area would be to not have any landscaping plant material around that home or any combustible materials. So making sure that everything that's within that first 5 feet around the home is non-combustible would be ideal. Here's where you'll want to put in some hardscaping, maybe statuary, yard art, things like that that are going to be non-combustible. The next zone is called the intermediate zone, and that's the next 5 to 30 feet out from the home. And this is usually where people, if they're going to have more showy type landscape plant material, they would be included here. You may have your irrigation zones here if you have automatic irrigation. But to really think about what's going in that intermediate zone, think about the types of plant material and not only the plant selection, but really think about the design and spacing of that plant material. Here's where we're going to remove any what's called ladder fuels, and I'll describe those in a moment here. Clear out any vegetation that can contribute to the fuel source. And ideally, you're keeping all grasses lower than 4 inches, whether they be native or turf grass stands. So just kind of looking at some clumps of trees. That first 5 feet, as I mentioned, you're not going to have any trees in that area. The next 5 to 30 feet, you would go ahead and you could have clumps of trees, but the ideal spacing between the clumps or groupings of trees would be 18 feet at the tree canopy, and that's the outermost edge of the tree canopy. And of course, you'll want to be projecting out as trees mature. They're going to get a wider and wider canopy up top, so you'll want to make sure you're planning ahead for that. So you can see in that intermediate zone, you want 18 feet between those plantings or groupings. And then as you get further out to the extended zone, you can start to have the clumpings or groupings a little bit closer together where the canopies are only 12 feet apart from one another. So let's take a closer look at that. You can see here's the 18-foot spacing in that intermediate zone. And then as you get 30 to 60 feet out, you can have the canopies about 12 feet apart. And then once you get beyond there, if you have a bigger property and you're 60 feet out from the home, then you can have groupings of plants together with 6 feet between the tree canopies. And again, this is so that you're going to be able to help change the way that fuel is throwing flames, the rate of spread, the intensification of the fuel base. If you're spacing accordingly and designing it well, then you're going to change how intense and how fast it moves. So some other things to think about in that intermediate zone. You want to think about if you're going to be using shrubs. For example, if you have a shrub that has a 3 foot wide spread at maturity, say for example, an azalea, you would want to go ahead and make sure you're putting space in between each of those plants. So you don't want to have full continuous plant material that's going to have a full, the way to look at your plant material, your shrubs would be if you have a continuous grouping of plants, that's going to be a continuous fuel source potentially without any interruption. And the idea is to have some interruption or fuel breaks in there. So for example, with this, you'd want to take out these two in between and leave that space so that even if that plant was to ignite, the length of the flame that was being thrown would not touch another plant and continue to create a fuel source or continuous fuel source. So you want to be thinking about the design or the layout. And you want to think about it within plantings and then also between plantings. Other things you want to consider in a fire-wise landscape is limbing and pruning. And if you're looking at what's underneath large canopy trees, you want to make sure that you're limbing up at least 3 times the height of what is beneath it. So for example, if you have a plant that gets 3 feet high, you're going to want to be removing all the limbs all the way up to about 9 feet so that you're breaking up that fuel ladder or that material that can take the fire from the ground all the way up. So for trees, normally 9 feet, 10 feet is going to be a minimum of how much you want to be pruning up off the ground. If you have grasses below your area, your trees in the area, you'll want to keep those grasses mowed down or use a weed whacker on them. Try and keep everything 4 inches or lower. So again, it's not going to be creating a fuel ladder or allowing that fuel to continue to move. And you should be pruning up your limbs or limbing up your trees, 10 feet or higher. And you're doing that on both any dead plant material. Hopefully, if you've got dead trees in there, you're totally taking those out or removing them. But dead limbs or live limbs, both should be getting pruned up. And here's an example of what that can look like. The photo on the right, you can see not only has there been thinning done, but those limbs, those lower limbs have been taken off. And you can see the grass is low. So I talked a little bit, I've been using that term ladder fuels and just to describe what that means, ladder fuels are created when you have different or varying heights of vegetation. So if you have grasses that can catch on fire and then they're going to catch the understory on fire, and that's going to take a surface fire up into a crown fire, it becomes a lot more difficult to put a crown fire out than it does a surface fire. And so we want to try and avoid that by getting rid of those fuels that are in between that can lend itself to creating a crown fire. So you can see in this slide on the right, you've got these really tall trees and you can see there's some understory trees coming up. Ideally, this is the perfect example of where ladder fuels can create a surface fire and turn it into a crown fire. Here's an example of a home that was part of the skeleton fire. And the homeowners actually had done a pretty good job at creating a defensible space around further out around the perimeter of their home. And the fire was moving around their home, but this is an example where an ember or a spark came in and the spark hit the vegetation that was closest to the home. a firebrand came in and hit juniper, which was around the home, and the juniper lit up and continued to burn continuously around the home. And you can see where it went up and around, caught the tree on fire, and you could see the roof line caught on fire. The only reason this home was actually saved is the fire crews were right in that area and they were able to get in there and protect that home. So one of the elements when I was talking about fire behavior was topography, and topography is something that's difficult to change. So you just need to be thoughtful. And if you have a house that's on a slope versus a house that's on flat land, or if you're upslope or downslope, what type of fuel is around your home? You can see in the diagram A here on flat ground that the smoke and flames just rise straight up as you would expect in a fire. But once you introduce a slope into the topography, you can see that the flames that are down below are going to preheat that fuel source above it. So it's going to preheat those trees, and they're going to light on fire a lot more quickly than the ones that would just be on flat land. And so it's really important to be thinking about how to clear the land downslope and or upslope around your home. So here's an example of a homeowner that did a really good job at clearing out the land downslope. You can see using just decorative rock. There's no vegetation up real close to that home. They could put some low growing perennials, ground covers in that section anywhere beyond the 5 feet out from the home. But other than that, they're going to want to keep everything else out. Here's a chart for use, and you'll have this access to this presentation. But depending on the type of slope you have around your home, you're going to want to clear out or modify or reduce those fuels around your home to a certain distance. And you can see usually you're going to clear out a lot more downslope than upslope, but just looking at the percentage of slope is going to determine how much you should be clearing out. If you're on a really steep slope, you're going to want to be clearing out quite a bit. Other things to be thinking about, there's a lot of things on a checklist for making a defensible, creating that defensible space around your home, like cleaning your gutters, using non-flammable building materials. Also think about what's happening underneath your deck. If you have openings underneath your deck where you're going to have pine needles collecting or just litter, leaf debris, those types of things, you're going to want to make sure you're cleaning that out routinely or somehow just excluding it so that it never shows up there in the first place. If this is an example where the lattice work, do you think that's going to be real sufficient in keeping out leaf litter? Probably not. So you're going to want to go in there and put something more solid. It's not going to allow anything to collect underneath there, because that's going to act as a fuel source if it's materials collecting under there at any given time. Here's another case study just to show you how creating a defensible space can really be successful in protecting a home. This again is the skeleton fire, which was here in the south part of Bend. And this fire was a very intense fire. You can see it went around this home. You can see everything burned around it. The garage off to the right of the screen, which you can't see, burned to the ground. And the neighbor's home to the right of the screen almost burned down, but was protected by the wildfire crews. This home survived primarily because of the turf grass stand that was around its home. And there's a high moisture content in lawns. And so it was able to allow that fire to go around without, and they also had non-combustible roofing material and siding material in their homes as well, but on their home as well. But this is an interesting example. So you can see everything around it burned. Take a look at the photos right behind the back porch there. If you look at a couple of those ponderosa pine, you can see they all got scorched in this wildfire. And then here's a photo 7 years later. This is after the wildfire, same home. You can see they added a garage on in the photo. But I think what's most interesting to me about this photo is to see like how the ponderosa pine fared. And even though the fire went through and scorched all those ponderosa pine, there were some that the buds themselves did not totally get scorched, and they were able to push out new growth in the subsequent seasons and continue to grow. So for today's presentation, when we're talking about fire resistance, there's kind of a few different definitions out there. Fire resistance can mean like from an ecological standpoint, it can mean the ability for a plant to withstand wildfires moving through over long extended periods of time. For example, seeds in the ground, like for example, tan oak here, would be considered a fire resistant plant for its ability to stay in a community that's known for wildfires moving through it. But what we're talking about in today's presentation is the ability for a plant to resist ignition or not sustain continued combustion. And so that's what I'm referring to when I'm talking about fire resistance for today's presentation. An example that would be cranesbill. So let's go over a couple of characteristics of highly flammable plants. These are going to be plants that contain dead or dry accumulated material where when they shed their needles or their leaves, they don't really fall to the ground, but somehow stay within the plant, creating and increasing that dead material is really going to increase the fuel source. Any leaves or twigs, stems, any part of the plant that's going to have volatile waxes, terpenes, or oils would be considered more flammable. And not only is it going to sustain combustion, but it may throw the flame length a lot further than plants that would be more fire resistant. If the leaves are aromatic, that can be a cue that it's a more flammable plant. Or if the sap is resinous, gummy, think about a lot of the conifers are going to have pitch. They're going to be more flammable types of plants. Or a plant that its natural characteristics, for example, birch, have more loose or papery bark to them. That could potentially be something that creates a more flammable plant. So here's an example of a traditional juniper hedge. We see this a lot around homes. And from the outside, it looks like it's somewhat green, kind of a silvery green. I was walking by the neighbors a few months ago and they had pruned their plant, I guess, to be off the sidewalk. Hopefully, maybe I'll get them to come to one of our pruning classes at some point because it worked to get it off the sidewalk, but not real healthy for the plant. But it was a great example for me to take a photo and show you what a close-up looks like of accumulated plant material. So you can see here, if we get it even a little bit closer, and you can see all the needles below it. This is a great example of a plant that's highly flammable because of its accumulated materials. And so all of that dead leaf material, not to mention that there's just, you're going to have some oils in the juniper that are really going to be flammable as well. So you want to try and avoid using any of these types of plant materials within that first intermediate zone, even out to the extended zone. I'd be avoiding these types of plants. I throw some Oregon examples up here, knowing that there may be some folks that are not from Oregon, but just to give you a sense or an idea of some plant material that would be considered more fire prone. And some of these are native and some of these are non-native. So that's not really an indicator necessarily one way or another of a plant being flammable or non-flammable. Mugo pine, for example, is a popular ornamental pine used in landscaping. That one is very flammable and usually will sustain combustion for a long period of time. Here's an example to the left of a fir tree where the branches were touching the roof line, and that's definitely something you want to avoid having. Again, that's definitely in that first 0 to 5 feet. You want to take everything like that out or remove that from the landscape for protection. So then what does it look like to have a fire resistant plant, or what are some characteristics of fire resistant plants? Most of your broadleaf deciduous being those that put on leaves and drop them later in the fall, are gonna be considered fire resistant. Again, as long as it doesn't have a real strong odor to the leaf, when you crush the leaf, it's likely more on the fire resistant side. Some of the thick evergreens like rhododendrons would also be considered more fire resistant. Here's an example of a native mock orange, and then an ornamental plant or red maple would be considered two types of fire resistant plants. The leaves tend to be supple, moist, and easily crushed in your hand. You should be able to get some moisture out of that leaf material when it's in regular growing season for a fire resistant type plant. They tend to be clean, meaning they're not going to accumulate the dead material. They're not going to have a lot of dieback on them. Same for shrubs. So you're looking for that for trees and shrubs. And generally, you're not going to have any odor to the sap or to the leaf material. So that would be another indicator of a more fire resistant type of plant. So when you're thinking about designing a fire-wise landscape, you're really wanting to, again, just think about spacing and design, breaking up those fuel ladders, and so that that fire is not going to make its way all the way to your home. Here's an example in this slide. You can see off to the left, there's some small young pine coming up, and then to the right are aspen. And so if the home's off to the right, then you're going to have a little bit of that fuel break in there. Aspen would be considered a fire resistant type of plant because of its leaf type, doesn't collect any debris or dead branches to it, typically in a healthy growing environment. And so it'd be about taking out anything that would be considered an in-between plant in size and shape, and anything that has any of those fire-prone characteristics you'd want to remove. One of the key items I want to mention is the plants need to be well maintained in order to maintain their fire resistant properties. And so if you have a fire resistant plant in the landscape, but it's not well watered and it's partially dead because it's under drought stress, it becomes more fire prone. And so the plant is only going to be as good as it is well maintained. If you have a well maintained fire resistant plant in your landscape, it will in fact help slow down the fire because it will have more moisture content to the leaves. The length of the flames will be shortened if there's more moisture content, and just the overall amount of heat will be reduced because of the moisture content. But if that plant's under drought stress or any other type of stress and just partially alive, you're going to see that change. So the condition of the plants is critical in maintaining a fire-wise landscape. Here's another example in this photo just to show you gravel being used as a mulching material around basket gold, flax, and aspen. Here's an example of a case study. This was 2007. It was here in Bend, the Aubrey Butte fire. A lot of construction was going on at the time, and somebody was cutting through pipe, and one of the while cutting through the pipe, there was some metal sparking coming off the piping, and it lit the hillside. It hit some of the native plants, that being sagebrush, bitterbrush is what you would normally find in this area, and lit them on fire. And then the fire started to race uphill because Aubrey Butte is a butte. And so you've got homes all the way up to the top of the butte. So here's an example of what happened here. These native plants were on fire and it started racing towards a couple of homes, unfortunately. And the fire started to move with the wind to the right of this on the slide here. And so you can kind of see where it started. We've got some native pine also on this butte. So here's a close-up of what that looks like. And here's another view of that. And you can see the plants that have been consumed in this particular, in front of this home, off to the right are going to be some Yugo pine, and you're going to see some spruce. Spruce is kind of the taller one, little bit to the right of center there. If you also take note, you can see the paint peeling to the left on the home from the radiant heat. And so most of the conifers that were in the proximity of this home did in fact burn. You can see in the foreground, there's some cotoneaster. It looks like cotoneaster did not burn in the same way that the mugo pine and the spruce did. And here's another showing you just how the house was scorched. And you can see the plant material, how close it is to the home. And again, it's the wrong type of plant material. If you are going to have something that close to the home, you want something that's more fire resistant rather than fire prone. Just another view. So here's another example of a home, and you can see how the fire burned everything in the foreground here on the slide, but then started to move up towards the home. And then it actually came up upon a shrub border that happened to be willow, and willow would have moist, supple leaves. Willow would be considered a fire resistant type of plant. And thankfully, the willow was where it was located because it really did act like a heat shield in this case. And right behind the willow, this is the back side of the willow. So to the right of the screen, it would be where the home is located, was a whole row of mugo pine. Thankfully, the willow was able to kind of shield that, and those mugo pine didn't ignite. And here's just another example of where you have the mix of both fire prone and fire resistant. So here, these are mugo pines. You can see they were completely consumed by the fire. And then right here are aspen trees that kind of shield the fire. You can see the leaves. There's still actually some leaf material left on those because they have some moisture content to them. Here's another case study. This is actually the home of a retired fire marshal here in this area. And so he has real low growing fire resistant plants, you know, right at around the porch area. Of course, non-combustible materials for building the home, a turf grass area to create that fuel break. And then if you go a little further out, you can see now there's a transitional zone where there's some clumpings of plant material and there's some native plant material. He also included a pond so that there would be a water supply if in case there ever was a wildfire. And then also just to show you another angle of his home of how he's cleared below the trees, you can see they're all limbed up. So there's where you're using those limbing up techniques, and you're also thinning out between trees, again, just to reduce that fuel load. So going through a checklist, if you have to prioritize, you just want to start taking out any dead, dying material, walk through your landscape. You'll want to take out any type of fire prone type plant material that's close to the home, nothing touching the roof line. Replacing mulching materials. If you had wood bark mulching materials around your home, you'll want to replace those with non-combustible mulching materials like gravel or decorative rock. And don't forget about the weeds. If you live in a place that, for example, has cheatgrass, you know, you want to be taking care of those weeds. So again, because they can act as a fuel source as well. So depending on where you live, you might want to say, well, how do I find out what type of fire resistant plant material can I be using? And this is an interesting dilemma because there is not, if you actually dig hard into the research on how much research has been done on fire resistant plant material, there's not a ton of research that's out there. Part of that is because that type of research is extremely expensive, and it's also hard to replicate that type of research as you move from area to area. So something that may be fire resistant in a clay type soil may be more or less fire resistant in a sandy type soil because of the way the plant pulls up moisture and holds it in the leaf material. So there's some variables there that can't be replicated. And so it makes it difficult to really put something into a category calling it fire resistant. What you have to do instead is use those characteristics we went over and observe the way the plant grows to determine whether or not it is more fire resistant or fire prone, and try and go through those two lists to determine what type of plant it may be. There are a few lists. We put a publication out. It's been a while now, and it's actually in the process of being revised. So there's some dated information in this publication, but it's fire resistant plants for home landscapes. I'm working with some others to update it, and we should have the new one out this year. But just so you know, when we put this guide out, I strictly used research only plants in here. And so the list was somewhat limiting, but again, that's because I wanted to use plants that I knew there was some research on the fire resistance of the plant. And so we just stuck with the research that we could find at the time, which this was back in 2006. Since then, some other guides have come out. And if you are in an environment that's more like the west side of Oregon, before we move on, I want to mention something else. If you're trying to find a list of fire resistant plants for your own region, this is what I'd recommend you do. Go into Google, type in the word fire resistant plants, type in the word site, put a colon with the qualifier edu, and it will pull up all the research-based information for fire resistant plants. And you'll see that there's just a handful of publications that are out there and available from different universities across the country, but you can find some from different types of environments, from Arizona, Utah, North Carolina, Washington. Those are the ones that come to mind that have some plant material guides out there if you're looking for something that's going to be close to your area. The Willamette Valley has a guide that's out and can be found at this website. And then this is probably the most inclusive one as far as ornamental plant material goes. So the original information we came out with in 2006, a lot of it was based on native plant material and done through work through forestry. But as far as ornamental plant materials, ones you commonly would find in a nursery, there's mostly people are going to use those characteristics to try and determine its fire resistance or not. As far as actual research that's been done, this one is probably one of the more extensive guides. It was put out in collaboration with University of Idaho. And let's see here. So I'm just going to pull up a page for you. It's a little complex kind of sorting through it, but it does have great information as far as zones, and the zones are now going to be, it's a little bit dated as well as far as those zones. The range is going to be changed a little bit from what used to be recommended to what I went over today as far as the 0 to 5 and 5 to 30. So you'll want to be looking at that a little more closely. But what was done in this research was they looked at mineral content, moisture content, volatile oil content, and then the height and the width of the plant to determine its fire resistance score. And they broke it out. So everything that had a fire resistance score between 8 and 10 could go in zone 1. And that could be anywhere from 10 to 30 feet out from your home. So they have the charts broken out really nice. And as you can see from this one page here that I have up, these are a lot of cultivated varieties. And so you'll probably be able to find some varieties you may have interest in knowing what's its fire resistance score and where should I put it. If it comes up and it's on the list and the fire resistance score for it is, going to be anywhere from 1 to 4, it's going to be a plant that you would not want to be putting right in that immediate zone around your home or in that extended zone even. It's going to be something you're going to want further out. And so that website is also included in the chat, I believe. And so you can access that and take a look at that. So the new guide that we're coming out with this year, we look at the research done here and we're going to pull it and make it into part of our pictorial plant guide. So you can be looking for that. At this time, let's see, it's 3:45. I'm going to go ahead and just breeze through a couple of fire resistant plants. And with the caveat that I know some of you may be in different areas and these may not be applicable, and just always to remind you that when you're looking to put plants into your landscape, you want to check with your local resources there, your local extension agent, and find out if it's make sure you're not using plants that are invasive to the area. We don't want to introduce that. And just looking for those fire resistant characteristics. So anything low growing ground covers are usually going to be a good choice if they're staying pretty small in size, just that 6 to 8 inches, and not up against the home even further out. But you can use these ones in this intermediate zone in the home ignition zone area. So here's some close up with snow in summer. And again, if you know this is a plant that's not a good one for your area, just that's okay. You can look for something that's going to have similar characteristics and or one that is going to work. Creeping phlox is going to be another one. That's the one that's in bloom in pink here. Creeping phlox, of course, comes in a variety of different colors. This is one, though, you want to keep well maintained. Sometimes I've seen these where they can start to die out and they get left that way. That wouldn't be good. So you want to make sure it's well maintained. Here's some different varieties, different flower colors for creeping phlox, likes full sun. Sedums, any of the sedums, the low growing stone crops, all of those are going to be ones that are going to have a high moisture content to them, drought tolerant, so they work really well in the western states. Here's two side by side, close up of that foliage. And here's one in bloom. Delosperma is very similar to sedum, and this is a nice plant. There's several different cultivated varieties of Delosperma that you can use, low growing ground cover. Here's hardy yellow ice plant, really tough plant for drought tolerance. And there's the purple ice plant. Pine leaf penstemon is the one in bloom here, kind of the reddish orange bloom. You can see that, one of the more long blooming perennials, but we have a lot of native perennial in Oregon and other places you can potentially use penstemon. There's a close up of the bloom on that. This is one where if you keep it deadheaded, it'll continue to bloom for you. Here's one of our natives, Richardson's penstemon. Yarrow, one of our, this is the cultivated variety, but we also have a native yarrow that can be used. There's our western yarrow, that's the native. You can see it attracts pollinators as well. Blue flax, another native, can be used. Sunrose is an old perennial, but also a good one. Comes in a variety of colors. We've got daylilies. Of course, they're a well-known perennial. Red hot poker. It's a taller one. So again, you want to think about placement of this. But this one's not going to sustain that flame. Yucca can be used. And again, something like, for example, with the yucca, once the flower head is spent, you'll want to go ahead and remove that so it doesn't dry out on you. Harold Mackie Daphne. Close up of that. Lilac, this is just the common lilac, but some of the hybrid lilac would also work. Again, keeping it cleaned out, making sure you're removing any dead canes. Close up of the blossom. Here's a native Lewis smock orange. And Rhodocea dogwood. Got a close up of the white bloom. One of our natives. There's the fruit set. And of course, it has interesting winter texture. Western spirea or Douglas spirea. There's a close up of the pink flower. And then you've got yellow fall color. Again, you'll want to keep this one cleaned up a little bit depending on where you place it. Here's an example of one of the red maple hybrids. And if maple's a good choice for your area, then it would be a good fire resistant plant. Red fall color. Aspen. Or Swedish aspen, which has a little more upright growth habit and orange yellow fall color to it. Crabapple, and I know not all regions can grow crab apples. In some areas it's not encouraged, but if you're able to grow it in your area, you can use those as a good choice for fire resistant trees. Here's a newer cultivar called Royal Raindrops. Another one of our natives, chokecherry in bloom. It's a white blossom. And the Schubert chokecherry is a cultivar with the red foliage. And then European mountain ash. Again, this may not be recommended for all areas, so you'd want to check with your local nursery to see if it's encouraged, or your extension agent in the area, and make sure it's not invasive. And then serviceberry, which we have native shrub forms of serviceberry and tree forms. There's a close-up of the blossom and then some of the fruit set. And then you get really nice fall color on the serviceberry as well. So I think that's leaves us some time for some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Amy Jo. I really learned a lot from that. It does look like there are some questions that our question wranglers had for you. One of them is from Julie. She said that in some cases it seems like there might be a conflict between fire plants versus those that are good for low water or drought areas. Can you address that?
Yes, that's a good question. And I've been asked that before. People with the hopes that fire-wise and water-wise plants kind of intersect. And we do have some examples of both, but there's also some examples where they don't. And so in that situation, it's hard, especially in the western part of the United States, where we're looking to be more water-wise in particular. And in that case, you have to prioritize which of those characteristics is more important for whatever the circumstances are you're looking to solve, because you don't always get that crossover. Sometimes plants that are water wise are not necessarily fire wise, and vice versa.
Thank you. Aaron asks that you mentioned some evergreens can be fire resistant. Can you name some of those?
Well, as far as there's some broadleaf evergreens that kind of fall into the category of being considered more fire resistant. So that would be, for example, rhododendron or azalea or Oregon grape.
Okay.
As far as true conifer evergreens, most are not going to be fire resistant. In our first guide that we put out, we did include ponderosa pine, and we did include western larch because they were considered partially fire resistant. And as you can see in that example I showed you, you can see the fire went through and didn't necessarily burn it to the ground. But there really isn't, it's really hard to put any conifer in that category. And with the rewrite we're going to do, I'm not sure we'll include any. So it's really just a few broadleaf evergreens and those couple that I just mentioned, like ponderosa pine, that are a little more tolerant of fire, and kind of don't throw the flames as much as some of the other evergreens would. But we really don't have any solid evergreens that are considered truly fire resistant that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Our next question, Amy Jo, is about mulch. Bark mulch is not fire resistant and is often spread broadly to save moisture, control weeds, and beautify the yard. This person is asking you to talk about alternatives that are organic, such as well broken down compost, and mentions that gravel and pavers are recommended alternatives in terms of fire resistance, I think. But they see those inorganic options as contributing to desertification. Can you talk about mulch options a little bit, please?
Yeah, if you're not wanting to, so yeah, again, this is coming back to the tough decision, like the tough decision we have to make on prioritizing what's our goal here? Because this one's tough to kind of solve in all ways. You can use what I would call an ultrafine compost would probably be your best option if you're not wanting to contribute to desert, heating, but you just want to make sure there's not really any big wood chunks left in it. And so it'd have to be an ultrafine compost to really be useful. There's pros and cons of that type of compost, and whether or not it can be used in your landscape successfully will depend on a lot of different variables as far as wind, because that one you'll lose a lot of that to the wind if it's not watered all the time. So then you're using more moisture. So there's always pros and cons, but if you're looking, I would say the best choice that I know of right now, if your goal is not to use something like decorative gravel or rock, and obviously not to use something that's more fire prone, it would be an ultrafine compost that's really well broken down and just fine textured could be used.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, so I'll try to cover the most popular questions that are left.
Okay.
The next one is from Joan. She says, if you have mature trees of various kinds, I'm concerned about taking out some might kill the remaining trees. How can you open space between mature forests by a house?
I guess I would encourage you to do it gradually. And so I'm not quite sure I understand if you're concerned by opening it up, like all of a sudden the light situation is different in that you might be providing too much light for plants that had less, or I'm not quite sure I know exactly what the question is, but I would just say move slowly then and taking those out if you're concerned about it being too much at one time. But just using taking out the closest ones first.
Thank you. I thought maybe that person meant the same about sunburn and light exposure as well. I hope that was helpful. Next question asks, please talk about the impacts of frequent and routine leaf litter removal in terms of soil microbiota. Lots of tough questions today.
Yeah. So it's just always this, I feel like we're always having to make these decisions because we can't have it all, so to speak. But I mean, hopefully we just continue to learn ways to get there. But yeah, if you're obviously, it helps to have some leaf litter debris for soil microorganisms, but not around the home. So this is coming back to priorities and what's the priority here. And if it's to protect the home, then you're going to want to have to do something different there. But if you're using, I would say if you're removing the leaf litter debris, but then you're adding again, ultrafine compost, there's an expense or a cost with that. Then you could be adding back to the soil where you're taking some of that out. You are going to be removing some habitat as well for some of our insects, which is again, a trade-off, but this is where it comes back to priorities. I can tell you, I've been asked so many times by landscape designers can you please add something else to the list regarding water-wise, or can you add something to the list regarding this? And it's just, well, first of all, there's no research behind to support adding that plant to the fire-resistant plant list. But secondly, then it just really comes back to prioritizing and what's the top priority here, because there's going to be some sort of give in another area, unfortunately.
Thank you. It looks like we have time for just one more. This person is asking how you would go about finding landscape firms that have the fire resistant or fire barrier experience.
That's a good question. Yeah, I would just, without knowing where you live, it's a little harder for me to answer, but I would just start asking around if they are familiar with Firewise landscaping by just calling local designers or architects. Places that, I guess on one hand I could give you is places that have CC&Rs, larger developments that have CC&Rs. They usually have a landscape design review board, and they usually are connected to a landscape architect or designer that's helping to design most of the homes in that area. I know where I live, we have a lot of home developments going in, and they have landscape designers or architects on their review boards for the landscape designs around homes because they're trying to keep these communities firewise. And so I would probably start there with some of the new community developments or just developments that are trying to be firewise in the area. And so you could check through Firewise USA maybe, or Project Wildfire, and see if you can locate an active group in your area, and they probably can connect you to local landscape designers or architects.
Thank you so much, Amy Jo. We really appreciate your time and expertise today. Remember, if you are seeking credit through the Oregon Landscape Board, that you can send an email to Heather Stoven so she can help facilitate that credit for you. We do appreciate everyone coming today. For our Master Gardener volunteers, you can receive continuing education credit for today's lesson. You want to coordinate that through your local Master Gardener County Coordinator. Our next webinar in this series is August 10th, and the subject is season extension. So that'll be at the on August 10th. We'll have season extension. And you can also look at the whole schedule for this series on our website. We sure hope to see you in the future. We appreciate that. And for those of you that had a few extra questions, we're going to go ahead and close the recording so we can stay within the time. But Amy Jo has indicated that she does have a little bit of extra time to answer those questions. So for those last few folks of you who have questions, we'll be happy to address those. Thank you so much, everyone, and happy gardening. All right, let's see. We have a couple more questions, Amy Jo.
Okay.
One says that most suggested plants that you talked about were ornamentals. Is there anything regarding food plants?
Yeah, some of the ones again, this comes back to where the research lies, and there's hardly any research to support, what I would call edible landscaping type plants. The serviceberry was one that I mentioned. You've got currant, some of the native currant would be ones that would provide a food source. There's no research that I'm aware of on, fruit trees or anything like that as far, but something like the fruit trees, you could adopt the characteristics probably, as long as the fruit tree has those clean characteristics to it, doesn't accumulate. Like, for example, crab apples in that mix, but you could adopt that for apple trees as long as you're keeping them pruned and cleaned. Same for pear trees or plums or cherries. I assume any of those, they stay pretty clean. I don't see any reason why those couldn't be considered more on the fire resistant side. But as far as actual finding research on edible landscape, there's not going to be much out there to support that at this time.
Thank you so much. Emily points out that organic matter in the soil helps increase the water holding capacity. And then Monica also mentioned that the Department of Forestry offers a class for landscapers. So you could ask your landscaper whether they had taken that class as well. So last call for any more questions. If anyone has those, we would like to address them. We'll give that just a minute. So a follow-up to a previous question. My question about the thinning trees in a mature forest was concern about the roots being disturbed. So by removing one tree, disturbing the roots of another tree, in case you wanted to address that further.
Yeah, I guess I would say if you have the ability to take a tree down and then just kind of, instead of ripping it out by the root system, if you have the ability to cut it down to ground level and then just grind out the stump, if you don't want that showing, rather than tear it out so that you don't disrupt the root system around it, which is probably likely intertwined with the trees that you want to keep that are there already.
Great. It looks like we've covered all of our questions. Amy, Joe, we really appreciate your time today. And also we appreciate the efforts of the folks that have been answering questions. And just keep in mind, after you've had a chance to digest this information, if you have additional questions, you can always reach out to your local county office, and any of our county folks will be happy to help you. We all work together. If we need to, we can reach out to other folks and get the information that you need. So once again, we appreciate you all being here today. And thank you so much for joining the Oregon Gardeners Level Up series. Have a great day.